Hey everybody, Dr. Rayner here. Excited to have you back for another episode. And this one today, we are going to touch on the importance of sleep in your weight loss journey. For many, it's an often underappreciated area where it can impact your weight. I know you may have heard of it, like being a big factor, but often we kind of like, oh no, it's probably more about the calories eat. Well, let's get into sleep because I think this is probably one of the biggest areas that people kind of really don't look at, they don't address. And then this kind of sets the tone for a lot of different hormone systems throughout the day where it can start to disrupt your sleep. I'm going to be completely honest, as a business owner, as trying to kind of, father, trying to go, husband, trying to just be in many places at once. I know I was guilty of not getting enough sleep. And I know when I addressed it, it helped me lose probably 10 to 15 pounds of pretty stubborn, frustrating body weight. And again, because I've always been active, an athlete, I've exercised, I've dedicated, I practice what I preach. I don't drink, I eat clean, move, exercise 5 out of 7 days a week is a minimum. And again, and it was kind of frustrating. I was kind of, regardless of what I did, I was seeing weight get put on. And I always kind of like prided myself like, oh, I could go off 5 to 6 hours of sleep and have plenty of energy and feel great and function off of that. And when you look at the data and the research, yeah, I might be feeling mentally fine and functioning, but metabolically, it was starting to impact me. So not only was I personally impacted by this, and again, it's easy to fix once you understand it. And then there's so many other cascading hormones and neurotransmitters that it has an impact on. So let's look at sleep and the optimal body weight, because I think this is critical. When you look at it, kind of 7 hours of sleep seems to be the sweet spot in terms of kind of the minimum. And then this is more kind of, I'm not talking about cognitive health. I'm talking about what it is in terms of weight and kind of maintaining a healthy weight. So in 2019, there's a study that came out that looked at 68,000 women, particularly they were nurses. And they followed them over 16 years. And so we know nurses, they have night shifts. So this is a very good demographic to follow. But what they found is nurses in this group, the women that fell under that 5 hour of sleep category had a significant increase in weight gain, even compared to the group that got 6 hours. And the group that got 6 hours had more weight gain compared to the group that got 7. Now, between 7 and 8, they didn't really seem to notice any fluctuation in weight. So this is a really good study. One, a large sample size. Two, we know sleep kind of habits, circadian rhythm can be off in nurses, night shift workers. So this is a really good group to look into. And it was over 16 years. So it wasn't like, oh, hey, we saw this. No, they saw the results and they were pretty consistent across the years and the large sample size. Now, let's kind of look into, why would this be a factor? Like, what is it about sleep? What systems are involved that might, when you start to have a disruption in regular sleep, what systems are involved that might kind of cause a cascading effect? So a very common word to kind of talk about sleep cycles, we call it the circadian rhythm. Some people call it our biological clock. It's a 24-hour cycle, impacts mood, cognition, hormones, biochemistry that's going on within the body. And this cycle repeats itself every 24 hours. And having a regular sleep cycle is incredibly critical to having a healthy circadian rhythm. It's our internal clock. We have immune responses, recovery responses are all based off of this. They're really critical brain centers that help regulate this. Daylight and light help us kind of shift and control it. And so there's so many influences into this. And so when we get into the role of the circadian rhythm kind of shoves and kind of sensitizes different hormone levels. And we're going to kind of go into these various hormones and neurotransmitters that we want to kind of talk on. Because again, I think if you are here and you're wanting to lose weight, but you also want to keep the weight off, then we have to encourage you to have a healthy circadian rhythm as optimal as possible. Okay. So when we look at circadian rhythm, we know it has impact into insulin hormones, which again determines how efficient you are with glucose usage, things like melatonin, growth hormone, hormones that influence hunger, fullness, thyroid, stress hormones, testosterone. So when you hear testosterone, you think lean body mass, muscle mass. So again, it controls everything. Now, the crazy part about when we talk about sleep disruption, a lot of times like, oh, it's only once here and there I don't have great sleep. It's like 2 nights a week I just trash my sleep. It's not great, but the rest is great. Research shows like 1 night of poor sleep can cause issues with a lot of these hormones we're going to discuss in this episode today. So let's look into what allows us to kind of fall asleep, and melatonin is that first one. So if you're watching on the YouTube feed, I have a graph up. This is kind of what an ideal melatonin pulse should look like. But again, as it starts to get dark out, our brain starts taking another neurotransmitter, serotonin, and starts allowing us to convert into melatonin. Melatonin is going to signal to the brain, hey, it's getting dark, nighttime, and more of a restful state. And it's allowing us to shut the brain down to accomplish that ability to fall asleep. So right then there, if you're somebody that has gained weight, and let's say you have, a history of insomnia, especially like if you have a history of depression, again, not all the time, but again, a lot of times we like to think of serotonin as the neurotransmitter behind it. It would make sense if there's depression, there may be insomnia, and if those two are combined, there may be stubborn weight gain over time. So the one thing with melatonin is this beautiful thing that also helps regulate the immune system, help us form antibodies. So if we're fighting something, getting a good night's sleep is critical. So there's all these effects around melatonin. So let's look though, kind of how does melatonin in terms of weight really matter? Because I think, again, yes, we can have a whole conversation about melatonin and all the effects, but today we're listening because of how it impacts weight gain. So there's been a lot of interesting research. And again, the main thing that kind of tends to hold true when it comes to melatonin is that melatonin, when it's at its peak, is best when you're at your peak fasting window. And when that occurs, what happens is, so the areas of your body that you where you make insulin, the beta cells of your pancreas, are going to have this kind of sensitization response when you have a peak melatonin response while you're at a peak fast. And again, when that happens, what they notice is the following 24 hours, you're much more insulin sensitive. So you're more efficient with using and burning glucose and bringing it into the cell when you have a peak responsive melatonin with a peak fasting state overnight. So again, if you're somebody that falls asleep, let's say you wake up at 2 a.m, you go grab a snack from the fridge, now you're bumping yourself out of that fasting state. Even let's say you might have hit a peak melatonin, you're not maintaining that peak fasting state. And this might be one area that is starting to mess with your insulin sensitivity and contributing to an increase in fat storage. Okay. So the other aspect, the biochemistry side of it, is like, well, what do we need to make serotonin and melatonin? So kind of on the biochemistry side, again, this is a whole aspect of our integrative functional health side of things, which we go into great lengths, is like, well, you need to be able to make serotonin and melatonin. So to make serotonin, obviously you need the building block, tryptophan. So you need to be consuming protein throughout the day. This is why, again, a lot of times we focus on getting adequate protein intake with our patients. You'll notice when you work with us, we'll give you a recommendation of protein intake for your target body weight, because when you break that protein down, one of the amino acids in it is going to be L-tryptophan. When we can take L-tryptophan and make it into an intermediate called 5-HTP, that step, though, is dependent upon iron. So what we want to make sure, too, is if you are anemic, then this may not be as efficient, especially iron-based anemias. You may not be able to do this conversion. And that might be part of why you have some depression and some insomnia in the first place. And then again, possibly some weight gain. If you can get to 5-HTP, we know that 5-HTP to serotonin is going to be dependent upon some B vitamins and magnesium. So again, are you deficient in any of those substrates? And that might be something that you have to discover. We'll go and have a whole episode on really, really thorough lab testing so we can give you a really good armor of lab tests that you can be a much better advocate for yourself. But for today, we're trying to keep it relative to sleep. But again, we want to give you a little bit of kind of bigger pieces to even to this melatonin story, right? So now the next part is, all right, we need serotonin to start conversion into melatonin. Well, we need nighttime. So we need darkness to start settling. So if you're somebody that is on your phone and bright lights constantly hitting your back of your eye, we know this is going to potentially delay and disrupt that. So this is really critical, having good sleep hygiene. Don't go to bed with lights on at your bedside table, the TV on, because again, blue lights and light in general is going to have that effect. Have, low angle light is light that's going to be kind of on a side table, more yellow in spectrum versus blue light will be more beneficial, but still you're going to want to kind of slowly titrate those down, right? Same thing in the morning. We're going to want you to get out, get good natural light in the first kind of hour of wakening. So go for a walk, even just get out, not through a window, but we want to get that low angle sunlight hitting the back of your eye, your retinal ganglion cells, because again, that's going to fire into very critical areas that kickstart your circadian rhythm. But again, that's a very good starting point for people to kind of start looking into kind of circadian rhythm, sleep cycle. And again, this is a little precursor just into melatonin and its role and how it can help play into better insulin sensitivity and how that determines better glucose usage and proper weight management. So kind of kicking in, we already talked about insulin, but what is insulin and why is it important in terms of weight? So probably the number one reason we start to see weight gain over time is we start to see insulin resistance kind of start to show up. Now, a lot of times when people hear insulin resistance, you might think, oh, hey, I'm not diabetic, though. I'm not even pre-diabetic. Yet we know at the cell level, when people start to gain weight, you don't have to be diabetic or pre-diabetic. From a lab standpoint, you often look at a lab called your hemoglobin A1C. And again, if you're above 5.6 to 6.4, that is a pre-diabetic range. If you're 6.4 or above, that is a diabetic range. The problem is you are probably kind of trending there long before you start to see those ranges achieved. Now, how do we know that? How do we look for that? Again, you might eat a meal, you might get fatigued following it. If you eat and you crash, or if you don't eat for a while, you get jittery. It's like you can't retrieve stored energy well, but yet you have some to retrieve. So as you're fasting, if you are 3 or 4 hours into a fast and you get kind of hangry or jittery, almost anxiety, again, you start thinking like, is there an issue with me retrieving stored energy? And again, if there's an issue to retrieve stored energy while you are fasting, what do you think that's doing in terms of weight gain? It's making it harder for you to burn stored energy. So the weight's going to be staying on more readily. So insulin is this beautiful hormone that's made by the beta cells of your pancreas. So when you eat, here again, for those who are on YouTube, you'll see this little graph of what's normal. Up on top, you see the glucose response, and following glucose is going to always be this insulin response. And again, we know the better you sleep because of what roles with melatonin. And I'm sure as we do research, there'll be other influences into insulin sensitivity with sleep. But right now, we know melatonin helps us become more efficient with insulin when we sleep and we're in a fasted state. So when you first wake up in the morning, though, your insulin should be the lowest it is because, again, insulin itself helps us bring glucose into the cell and transports it in, right? So if you're not eating through the night, you don't need insulin. Now, the problem is, as we get insulin resistant, we require more and more insulin to do the job. So we start having higher fasting insulin. So now in the morning, instead of having a fasting insulin at 5, it's at 20. The problem is insulin is going to inhibit lipid retrieval or fat retrieval. It's going to make it hard for you to go after that stored energy. Now, what does this look like to somebody that's having, trying to have a good night's sleep? You might wake up throughout the night. You might wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. as you start to fast for a period of time. You might wake up with your mind racing. You might wake up hungry. You might wake up a little anxious, or you just might wake up like, I don't get it. I'm just more restless. And I can't get back into a good sleep. And again, this could be because of some of these dynamics with your fasting insulin being a little too high and not kind of dropping down and impairing your retrieval of stored energy. But again, very common when you start to see weight gain, that insulin goes up. Again, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you'll see this kind of loop. You eat food, you're going to secrete insulin. So anytime anything sweet touches your tongue, your brain's pretty smart. It's even going to start to anticipate that glucose is coming. So there's still going to be a insulin response. So this is important in those who are like, oh, hey, this is a diet soda. This is a sugar-free drink. There's still insulin responses because of those. So even though you're drinking a sugar-free drink, it's like your body's still anticipating glucose, and there's still going to be an insulin kind of pulse. It's not going to be as significant as if you ate a meal full of carbohydrates and glucose, but it still is going to happen in some extent. Now, when you get resistant to insulin, your body is more likely to store your calorie as fat and bring it into a adipocyte or a fat cell versus bringing it into your cell and burning it, right? So you might be more lethargic, fatigued, because again, instead of you taking up these cells, the glucose into neurons and you're having energy, your body's kind of trapped. It doesn't necessarily know how to do it. So you might feel fatigue, brain fog, muscle, like you're just more lethargic, right? This is why keto became such a big thing for weight loss, because again, a lot of people are insulin resistant. So when they go to keto and they actually successfully do it, ketosis, kind of you're trying to kick insulin out of the equation, right? Because you're like, hey, look, I'm losing efficiency, and ketosis, to burn fat as a fuel, you start to lower insulin as long as you're not kind of overdoing your carbohydrates and glucose. But this is one of the reasons why ketosis and keto diets were so popular in the last few years, because it kind of combats insulin resistance. And when we look at 1/3 of the population is potentially pre-diabetic or diabetic, up to about 50% in the adult population, it starts to make sense why this could be a popular fad. Again, and I say fad, but it could be, it's understandable why people fell into it and why they liked it, because it started to solve a potential biochemical problem going on in their body. So cortisol is kind of like, if you look to insulin, cortisol is kind of the yin to the yang kind of with insulin. So when you fast, cortisol is often known as, you're like, oh, it's my stress hormone. Cortisol wears multiple hats. It helps you maintain your fasting glucose. So when you don't eat, you're going to see more dependence upon fasting hormones like cortisol. And so when you first wake up in the morning, and for that first kind of hour afterwards, cortisol should be at its peak. Now, this is not always the case. You can have like rhythms of cortisol can get off where it peaks at bedtime. You can't initiate sleep, and then you're tired in the morning. But ultimately, when cortisol is working optimally, it is going to allow you to peak in the morning. It's allow you to go after fasting calories. So go after fat while you're sleeping, maintain your fasting glucose overnight, keeps you asleep. And finally, when it gets high enough, it's going to talk to your midbrain and say, hey, let's wake up. And that is all essentially your cortisol awakening response. And it tells you to get up, and you wake up with some good energy. You don't have to hit snooze 20 times. You're good to go. At nighttime, cortisol is going to be at its lowest, allows you to get into a restful slumber, right? So that is cortisol. Now, if people are very stressed out, you might see higher cortisol levels. And a lot of times people are like, oh, cortisol is associated with like stress body weight, which is usually that weight trapped around the midsection. It is, because a lot of times cortisol is a steroid. So it's also very good at getting your body to pulse these surges of glucose into it. And again, if you are not efficient at using it, it's very easy for you to kind of have these big spurts of glucose, which allows that kind of go from glycogen wrapped around liver and muscle to be transported more towards a fat storage molecule. So cortisol is a huge, huge critical hormone. And if you haven't had it run on a lab test, I encourage you to have both cortisol and your fasting insulin, both of them fasting, to be run. Because again, it tells us a lot. If you have a morning insulin that is high and a cortisol that is, even if your cortisol is comparable to your insulin, it makes sense why weight has been stuck. And it's something that, again, having a strategy to make sure it gets better over your weight loss journey is going to give you better outcomes as you come out of your program, and to keep that weight off. Because ultimately, our goal is to not only help you lose weight, but understand why it got there in the first place. So you have an empowered strategy to keep it off after you lose your weight. So, two other really fascinating hormones are called leptin and ghrelin. Now, one tells us we're full, which is going to be your leptin, and the other one is going to be ghrelin, that is going to tell us we're hungry. And so a lot of times when we have sleep disruption, and this is the crazy part, it only takes one night of sleep disruption to cause disruption of your leptin and ghrelin levels. And so as you sleep, your leptin level should actually go up. And again, this, you think, hey, but I'm not eating, so I should actually maybe start to feel hungry. But leptin levels go up so you don't wake up feeling hungry at 3 a.m. and have to go to the fridge, right? So leptin tells us we're satiated, we're full. They should go up in a normal, restful sleep. And then ghrelin levels should go down, so we're not waking up with hunger cravings overnight, boom, allowing us to sleep. So what happens though when you have a decrease in your sleep, you see a lower leptin level and you see a higher ghrelin level. So the next day, you're more likely to have food cravings that are not warranted. This is one of the mechanisms. And if this is going on and you're not having proper sleep, this is a very easy way where it's just you're putting more calories in because of sleep disruption, right? So again, another way having a disruption in sleep can kind of start to trigger, a pattern for the next day. It's going to make it harder to have a good lifestyle, good dietary choices, cravings that maybe shouldn't be there, but because your sleep is off, you're having these cravings you normally wouldn't have. So key, 7 hours of sleep optimizes a ton of great hormones. So here's another lab, another kind of marker, growth hormone. So we know that your kind of peak secretion of growth hormone is in that first 2 hours of sleep. So people are like, okay, well, if I sleep great for 2 hours, or if I can sleep for 2 hours, hey, there we go. That's true, but again, the quality. So it's really important that first 2 hours of sleep is a really high quality to get your optimal secretion and pulse of growth hormone. So again, don't fall asleep with lights on, TV on, sound blasting, because again, it's going to impact your actual quality and restfulness of those first couple hours, and this is going to have an impact on your growth hormone. Now, well, why should you care about growth hormone? Well, growth hormone is another way of promoting lean body mass and maintaining it. We know as we age, it's harder and harder for us to have optimal growth hormone. So maintaining and doing everything we can to fight for optimal growth hormones is critical to maintaining healthy lean body mass. We know there's really good immunoregulation, so it helps us have good immune system responses, and it also helps us with good tissue repair responses. If you ever heard like, oh, well, if somebody ever unfortunately has had to have surgery or has been injured, like, oh, it's way easier to have this surgery when you're younger versus older. Again, there are hormonal reasons for it. Growth hormone is one. Again, it's easier to sometimes go on a diet and see an impact when we're younger. Hormone can be one of those factors. Growth hormone in particular, though, is often associated with lean body mass. And so again, having a good sleep cycle where you get to bed consistently. So growth hormone also benefits kind of from a regular rhythm, going to bed at 10 every night, waking up at 7, going to bed. And again, a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I sleep 7 hours, but it might bounce around. Our circadian rhythm likes a very good rhythm that's consistent. So again, that can also influence growth hormone. Last but not least, we're going to touch on a hormone called adiponectin. So adiponectin is very, very interesting because it's what's called a diptokine. So it's a little protein messenger that is released from fat cells. Now, it's interesting because you think, oh, the more fat cells I have, the more adiponectin I should have. Not always the case. You may have more ability to secrete it, but it doesn't mean you do. So we know when people do not have great sleep, you see a decrease in adiponectin, right? So let's say we ran labs, which I encourage people. Adiponectin is a lab marker that is good to check on, especially if you're focused on losing weight and maintaining it. And we want to see an adiponectin level that is around 10 and above. So a lot of times people, when they come in with, kind of stubborn weight gain, they're having trouble losing it, their adiponectin levels around 3, 4, or below. This just tells us, that weight is going to be more likely to be trapped and hard. So even if you hit a calorie deficit, when you fast, adiponectin should go up, helping you target fat as a fuel. And so again, picture if your adiponectin levels are low and you're fasting 12, 14 hours, you think about, I should be losing weight. I'm eating less than I'm putting in. But again, if adiponectin is low, your body doesn't necessarily have any help going after fat as a fuel. So not only is it not, you're not losing weight, you might feel tired, fatigued, hangry, jittery, because again, we want to maintain glucose. When our brain that consumes 25% of all of our glucose needs doesn't get it, it's going to make us very hangry, motivated to go fix this problem. And that's kind of why you see some of these like aggressive type symptoms in people. When they get hungry, they get maybe a little snarly, hangry, you can say. Again, if you can't get calories to the fuel, the brain, its first goal is to keep you alive, and it's going to make you motivated to fix the problem. So it's going to give you kind of the motivation to go hunt or gonna go find that calorie. Even though if you got 30, 40 pounds to lose, you should have a way to go after when it's stored on you. Unfortunately, though, again, in the case of this, let's say you're not sleeping efficiently or you're kind of undersleeping. The problem is you may not having the adiponectin sensitivity that you should have. And then there you go. Now you didn't sleep great. You don't have the same pulse of adiponectin. And now you're not efficient at retrieving stored energy for that following day, right? So there's so many different ways that sleep can be a benefactor in your weight loss journey. And again, there's more, but this is a starting point. I wanted to kind of give you guys some tools around sleep, and just get some knowledge transferred over to maybe like if sleep is not a strong point on you or it's not as good as it can be, you start thinking about and taking it serious. Like, hey, you know what? I am one of those people like Dr. Matt, where again, I can go on 5 hours of sleep and feel great, but maybe I shouldn't. Or maybe you don't sleep well and it's kind of like, I'll fix it at some point. Well, maybe this is the motivation to kind of figure out how to fix it. We know too, though, sometimes when you look at medications that are help with sleep, they can be associated with weight gain because they don't always kind of consider all these hormones that are involved. They might help in one area and make you drowsy and fall asleep, but they kind of suppress the normal circadian rhythm. So again, whether it's with us, whether it's with another resource, support proper sleep hygiene, get lights down, get morning sunlight, work on the glucose things, eat well. And a lot of times what we'll have and tell our patients is the very first meal of the day should be very protein and healthy fat supported. All right. We want that first kind of pulse of insulin to be kind of like a gentle nudge. It's going to be the lowest. So we don't want to have this kind of crazy spike of insulin and glucose. So again, have a couple eggs, have some avocado, but really think fat and protein to start the day, not oatmeal, toast, carbohydrates. A lot of time that sets you up for this roller coaster of glucose, cortisol, and insulin throughout the day, and you're always kind of chasing it. So that's kind of a really initial advice, but that's also kind of when we kind of created our dietary support guide. It's really with this in mind, is making sure we're giving you at least the fuel and the building blocks to try to support from a general kind of support. Doesn't mean that there may be some nuances, but again, a very generalized support. So I really hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful. I hope this kind of emphasized the importance of sleep, especially getting around that 7-hour mark, in terms of how important that is in your weight loss journey. Now, We'll have other episodes where we go really into, kind of what blood work should be your kind of on at least a yearly basis, whether it's twice a year from a weight loss standpoint, because there's more than this, much, much more. Also, more on, we'll have one on supplements. Like, what can I do if cortisol's too high? What if cortisol's too low? There's things we can do to kind of support that as well. And we'll have those along the way. So I hope this was informative. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Our office number is 469-409-5824. You can text it, you can call it, but we're here to help and be a support. And if there's something that you want more information on, I'm happy to have that as a future episode. Just let us know. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon.